So, hello, everybody. This is James Tabor, and I have a YouTube guest today, Robyn Faith Walsh, and we're going to talk about some of her work. Many of you might have seen her before. So, this is going to be exciting. I can't wait. And I'm going to share my screen because first I want people to know about your website and get a little background. This is going to be really hard to find. It's robynfaithwalsh.com. So I know that's going to be harder. I'm just joking, of course. Mine is jamestabor.com. So if you can remember people's names, you can get this. It's really a great website. It's better than mine. So whether you want the latest or media research or whatever, but here's a little bio. Let's just kind of read this together. Robyn is an associate professor at the University of Miami. She got her PhD from Brown, but please notice the field, religions of the ancient Mediterranean, with the focus on early Christianity, ancient Judaism, and Roman archaeology. I'm telling you, that says it, because this is what we want. You know, just a very broad approach, but then coming down and talking about Christianity. So I have a question for you, Robyn. You've approached your understanding of the various forms of Judaisms and emerging Christianities, plural, because there's a lot of diversity, in the broader context of ancient Mediterranean culture, ethnic history. I could add philosophy, cosmology. I put here gods and humans, like what is a god? What is a human? Can a human be kind of a god or a half god? And how do you get to be that? And so to what degree does that approach contrast with a more traditional, and I don't mean this bad, but insulated theological approach, either Jews or Christians, but we're thinking particularly Christians because this is New Testament.
So you say something very important, which is that when we talk about the distinctions between, let's call it a historical approach and a theological approach, and there are distinctions that we should talk about, it's not pejorative. We're not trying to say a theological approach is wrong. It's just that a theological approach is going to ask different questions and usually comes from a different standpoint than a historical one. And what I mean by that is it's exceptionally difficult to separate how people practice their faith in particular or understand it in a contemporary standpoint, and then take that and look backwards at something like the text of Paul or the Gospels or anything in the New Testament, and not see it as a window or a reflection of that religion is already cohesive, it already has a developed theology that can be identified and discussed, and that often looking back on these texts, it's there to reaffirm ideas that are already sort of baked into the cake with whatever religious questions you're bringing to the text. What I think you and I try to do with a historical approach is to say that Christianity, Judaism, and especially, again, Christianity, because we're talking about the New Testament, which is coming from Jewish sources and writers, right? So we can talk more about that. But if we're thinking about Christianity as, call it a new religious movement, but a ancient Mediterranean religion, there are certain things we have to look at as historians to understand, as you say, that context. So I love talking about Romans. It's my favorite letter. I think the three I usually teach with are Romans, Corinthians, and Galatians. Those are the three. But the reason, I love those three.
And Philemon I throw in because of, oh my God, he is so diplomatically weird I shouldn't say weird because that's a bad word in our current political context, but oh my God, what a complex letter. Because he's really bound and determined to get his way, but I'm not asking or, so yeah, I love
well, it brings a lot of complexity to the character, right? Or who, you're reconstructing.
You see his personality, yeah.
But the thing I like about Romans is that it brings to the fore a couple of things that relate to what we're talking about. The first is that it's his latest letter. And so we don't know if he ever actually makes it to Rome. I know there's a church history that he does, and he's martyred there. He's trying to get to Spain. And there are even some church traditions that talk about him making it to Spain, or, there's artwork that talks about this. But he is basically presenting what I've called elsewhere a spiritual CV. It's like his resume. He's trying to say to these Romans, this is why you should sponsor me and bring me to Rome to talk to you more about these ideas. And he's presenting sometimes people call it a more mature theology, but he's basically putting his best foot forward to try to convince these people to sponsor him and to bring him to Rome. And so he, in doing that, it's a great review. It's kind of like the best of Paul. So it's a great letter to look at for that reason. But it's also, it stands out to people sometimes to when they realize he hasn't been there, right? So this is not a Pauline community that he has founded. This is a group of, Jesus curious people, whatever term we want to use, Jesus movement, early Christian
I like
movement.
that,
We're not really
Jesus
using the word
curious. That's a good one.
Jesus curious at the very
Yeah.
least. And so somehow that ecclesia has coalesced, in that particular place, and he's trying to get himself there to present himself to them. So when we think about early Christianity and its development, that's really interesting too. And it challenges this idea that every time you have a Pauline letter, this is a cohesive Christian community that sees Paul as an authority. And so therefore, everything he says has to be taken as, should I use the word gospel? I shouldn't,
Right.
but should be taken as a serious position taking on the early church. I think that can be really troubled for a number of reasons. I mean, obviously with Romans, because he hasn't met them, but also it brings us into a different perspective back to the historical, where you have to really think about the development sociologically of how new religious movements form. What kind of interests do these people have that can be political, economic, as well as what we might call religious? There's a lot going on there that I think we miss if we just assume these people are writing by for religious communities. And that's the other reason I like Corinthians, because once you look at the letter to the Corinthians, you realize, oh my God, these people have, there's a little cohesiveness in that community, the way that at least Paul would be happy with, right? Even Galatians, he's mad at them at the beginning. And you see the tensions and the different social spheres at work. And it really gives us, I think, a richer idea or a more textured way to understand how this movement starts to develop. And then the other thing is, there's a tendency, and we talked about this a little bit before we were recording, but coming from the perspective of classics, so I started in classics and then started to develop my interest in the New Testament and New Testament texts and history, archaeology, etc. But one thing you can sometimes see is it gets very idiosyncratic when you see Greek New Testament terms that are sometimes translated differently than you find in other Greek texts, especially philosophical texts. And that's very, very strange, because when someone like Paul is using Greek philosophy, he's an excellent Middle Platonist for his time period, which means that he's been educated in a way that he is very familiar with Platonic ideas, with Platonism, and very interested and well acquainted with Stoicism. And he combines those things together in the way that he presents himself, which is, I think, ultimately between his knowledge of philosophy and his ability to engage those intellectual ideas, which were not exclusive to Christianity, but part of the interest of the ancient Mediterranean broadly at the time for anyone who wants to hobnob in those kind of intellectual ideas or sort of emulate what they see going on with the native aristocracy and, the wealthy at the time. That, and also Judaism, was very interesting to people who were not within Judaism already. So because, the Hebrew scriptures were very ancient, we know that people were quite curious about what's in those texts. And also in this period too, as Rome expands the empire, anytime they, I guess we would call it, colonize a new people, whether it's the Judeans or the Germans, there's always a kind of renewed interest in the history of those people and their religious traditions. I mean, the Egyptians as well, right? What's going on with their gods and what's going on with their narratives. And so I think all of those in combination give us a different view of how Christianity starts. It's not just that Jesus is born, died, is resurrected, and therefore everybody just automatically understands. And when Paul comes to the door, you answer and you say, yes, Paul, I'm going to abandon my whole life and, follow what you're saying about a Judean peasant who was executed. That doesn't make a great deal of sense to me as a social formation.
No. And
but what makes sense to me. Oh, no, you go ahead. I've been talking long enough.
That's fine. There's a little bit of a delay, but it's
okay. Yeah, no, you go ahead.
So he's coming, what you're saying is, people don't think of this. He's coming with an ancient tradition of what we would call, some of the Jewish scriptures and texts that could trump Plato or any Greek writer, even going all the way back to Homer, at least it was believed, like Moses is way back there. And also he's from the exoticness of Egypt too, like this is a product of somebody who comes out of Egypt. And you mentioned Philo of Alexandria. I wonder how they would have dialogued. Have you ever tried to imagine something like that? Would
Paul
Philo
and
think
Philo,
how
yeah.
would, not whether he'd become a Christian, but would they talk on sort of
I think
same,
so.
they
I've
would agree
actually,
on a number of things, I think, certainly the cosmos and
well, I don't want to tell tales out of school, but so maybe I won't use the name, but I did have a professor who once told me that he was pretty sure that Philo probably had heard of Paul because there are not too many people out there doing what the two of them are doing. Now,
yeah.
Philo, he's in Alexandria, a great center of learning. He's related to the royal family through marriage. He's
Mhm.
certainly more of the elite of the elite. I don't just mean economically, but socially. He's part of
Yeah.
a titled family and far more established than, Paul's maybe more middle management than Philo is. But you hit on something really important, which is, we don't have that many writings from Middle Platonists in general. We don't have that many writings from even Pharisees, right? Especially from this period. We're quite lucky to even have the works of Paul. But what you have with someone like Philo, like Paul, like Josephus, especially when Josephus feels more free to write, is this claim that whatever you think is great about Platonism, whatever you think is great about any of these philosophers or these, moral systems or cosmology, what have you, whatever you think is great was already in the Jewish scriptures. Moses already said it before Plato. This is far more ancient. And in this period, and I would say probably today, there's a degree to which this is still the case, the more ancient something is, the more you could claim it. The idea of origins was incredibly important, but
Oh,
antiquity is incredibly
absolutely.
important.
Everything
Yeah,
else is derivative. And people read the Jewish War. Josephus is, of course, the first century historian. Many of our YouTube people know this because they follow this kind of stuff closely. But everyone reads the Jewish War, and oh boy, we would be lost without it. It fills in so many things. But the Antiquities is basically Genesis 1:1 up to Alexander the Great coming into the area. And wow. And then he has his debate with Greek thinkers and so forth. And so you've got this side, he argues that with a Greek philosopher, Appian, and he says, look, we got old stuff. Your people were living in caves when we were intellectually, he didn't say that, but you get the idea.
he applies that, and Philo
Yeah,
does something very similar. It's actually, when you read these texts, it's quite fun the way that
yeah,
they sort of go after their, let's
each
call it,
other.
their
Yeah. We're
competition. Yeah, yeah.
Our
So
religion's
that,
older than your religion, and yours is
yeah,
derived from ours, so maybe you should listen to us. And boy, just to have a book, even though it's not a codex bound together yet, but we do get the Septuagint at some point. We think it was it's generally the legend is, first, second century BCE. But I mean, that's
and
amazing
it
to have a thing you could read and say, oh yeah, the creator of the universe gave these 10 commandments and these laws, and people admired that. They thought, wow, that would be a good code.
this gets at your original question, which is, so what's the difference between doing history and theology? Well, here's one place where we can point that out, which is we've just given a very different social model for why someone would be attracted to the Christian message than I think what I call it in my book is the Big Bang. Like it's supposed to be self-evident and people will automatically, quote unquote, convert to this new religion. Well, it's not that simple. I mean, even for Paul, this is something you mentioned. Paula Fredrickson has talked about, what does conversion mean? We have this idea that
Mm.
Paul converts to Christianity. Well, that's not even a word in his vocabulary yet.
Mm.
He sees this as a Jewish movement, but one that's incorporating the Gentiles.
It's
But,
what
never this.
the God of Israel has now acted again, and you guys need to catch up on his latest
Exactly.
activities. You
Yeah.
got this right, but did you know he did something lately, like send the Messiah, which you have been waiting for? And wow,
Mhm.
people could go like, really? Is he just like some fake guy that got killed? And Paul could handle that question, I think. So
Yeah. Yeah. So he didn't quite, he didn't convert to Christianity as much as Acts, a later text wants you to believe
yeah.
that. But those are the kind of questions we bring to the table, I think, in how we do what we
Yeah.
do and the different
So I've got
methodologies we
another
use.
one. It's really overlapping, but I get this from students all the time. Many of our students and the public more generally, and this is my word, mistakenly think that a critical historical approach or method in reading biblical texts is a negative enterprise. The word
Mm.
critical historical, that scholars are essentially destroying and casting doubt on the veracity of these sacred texts, considered the word of God by millions. So I get students, I know you do too. Demographically, we know many of our students are coming from these backgrounds. And I want to ask you, I find that they can be very enlightened and excited about this, even if they have their own faith views. Like all the things you just mentioned, I mean, don't you want to know that? Like, what would it be like for Paul to set up, according to the book of Acts, I don't know if this is exactly valid, but he sets up a lecture hall and talks to people and they're coming. Well, what would that be like? Like, what would he say? I also wonder, where did he sleep at night? You had mentioned patrons. I assume he's probably living under the roof, wouldn't you think? What would you think? I mean, I don't think, he's probably living in a household and therefore interacting.
I
He,
think sometimes if we take him at his word that he's doing something with his hands, it's, some kind
yeah,
of leather working. I think some people have said he's making tents or awnings or something.
yeah.
He could be in an insula. So this is an ancient, essentially apartment building. So in antiquity, you would
Okay,
have the
so
first
he could
floor would
have his
be like a
private little,
storefront, and
mhm.
yeah, then you would
Is
have
that like a
the apartments
studio
above.
apartment for Paul or something?
Basically, yeah. So that could be one way that we imagine it. But he's living a fairly
But he's got
nomadic
to eat
life.
meals, he might not have a
Yeah.
kitchen in that room, so he might get invited out to dinner and so forth. Now, I don't,
Again,
does that ever happen when you're teaching that you get that Zoom thing?
no, it happens when it happens in FaceTime too. So my look at
Oh,
I don't
now
know
it
why
doesn't
it's just
like you saying
yeah, it
FaceTime
doesn't like me
because it's an
saying that.
alternative thing. Well, I like Twitter. Oh, X. Ooh, listen to this.
Oh, yeah,
Who is
no.
that? Who is that person doing that?
It must be some ghost behind you, but I don't know if it's about what I'm saying or what you're saying.
Is
But
it
some
Robyn or me? Point, please.
yeah, this is like an Ouija board.
Is it me?
No, it's
No.
me.
Oh, it's
Yeah, so
Robyn.
it must be me.
I want to see
Can
him.
I?
I want to see this. Thank
There you
Robyn.
I don't have it.
You violated. I asked, is it Robyn or me? It's you. You're saying
I must be saying it must have been the Insula
the
comment. I think
I think
yeah.
it's the Zoom police.
Yeah.
That's so funny. No, that's happened when I remember during COVID, we would teach online. And I would be
Yeah,
making some point, and all of a sudden the kids would go
and that would
wild because they'd be
happen.
like, Dr. And I would think, what did I say? I was saying like good things that
Yeah, now I'm self-conscious. Now
I
I
don't
have
know
to be
what to do.
careful what I say.
Okay, that is so funny. I'm so glad it happened, though. I'm so glad it happened. Who are you?
We should
Decides to
ask it more
hide,
questions.
decides to hide now. Okay, so what does Romans 3:15 mean if you know so much? Because I don't even know what it says. I just made that up, but I know there are 15 verses in chapter 3.
Ask the ghost. Don't ask me. I'd have to
Yeah.
grab. I'm looking now for a Bible somewhere.
So
I left my
anyway,
Nestle out at home.
that's great. And you think of the big words, like you mentioned vocabulary. I
Yeah.
got my Liddell Scott nut here, but the big thick thing that we've all worn out over all these decades looking. Yeah, there you go. See, there you go.
It's right here. Yep.
By the way,
Always within
Robyn,
reach.
I taught with Robert Wilkin at Notre Dame for a few years, and he went to UVA then, and his Liddell Scott, that particular, not the abridged, it
Yeah.
was dog-eared, and it looked like when he turned the pages, it looked like, oh my goodness.
Yeah. I have a
So
couple.
mine's
This
not
one, this
quite
is the
like
big
that,
one.
but I've spent hundreds of hours in that thing, and now I have it electronically, thank God, so I can.
Mhm.
But anyway, the point is you look up a word, just a common word used in the Hellenistic period, maybe even a Koine Greek, as we call it, common word. And like you said, it gives all of these references in classical literature and then later literature. And it's really important for us to try to understand as much as possible what it might have meant. And I think like one of the lectures that we're going to have on sexuality, you can't
Yeah,
talk about sexuality without a set of about 5 to 7 Greek words. And they've been translated horribly many times. And, because we have this standard, it starts with the Geneva Bible and Tyndale, and then it goes on to the King James
right.
and the American Standard and the Revised Standard and the New Revised. So, and there is a kind of a theological wave that's going. And I majored in Greek in college, and my dad said, "What are you going to do with that?" Well, here I am doing something with it. But
Same.
but it was the same thing. It was like, well, I want to know as much as possible about what some of these words mean. And I know there's the
Yeah.
theological dictionary of the Bible, and it has some uses, but I like to just look up how did Philo use a word and how did Joseph, get some contemporaries.
No, absolutely. I mean, that's how, as I mentioned, I got into the field. I majored in Greek, and at some point, it was just like me and one other student in the Medea seminar. So by my senior year, my Greek professor, Nancy Evans, recommended that I take New Testament. And so I actually read it with Rabbi Jonathan Brumberg Krause. So we would
Oh
sit,
yeah,
for a couple of
yeah.
hours every
Wow.
week and translate together. And I was just so confused why certain words suddenly magically changed when you
Yeah.
were translating Christian texts. I mean, it's the same dictionary, but then you had to use a different dictionary. But why?
Yeah, right.
It's those
Yeah.
questions that really bothered
So you
me.
get
And
out
also,
Bauer, and Art and Gingrich,
yeah,
as we call it, if you want to know what the New Testament meant. But then if you
which makes no
no
sense.
sense at all,
It
because
didn't
like
make
we're
any sense.
speaking in English now, and we could speak academically, or I could say I need to go get a glass of water, and I mean, whatever.
And it's not to say that words can't change how they resonate. So you mentioned like we use the word weird right now. It means something different than it did even 3 weeks ago, right? But the word still has a core meaning. And I think sometimes what would happen when I translate the New Testament is a term that made the text make more sense was still being
Mhm.
translated differently,
Yeah,
or a clause. And so the one I've talked about the most, in these interviews is pneuma, which is how we translate spirit. Well, if you understand what pneuma is as a physical substance within Stoic cosmology, the function of pneuma and Paul and the Gospels makes a heck of a lot more sense than the
I know.
Trinitarian model
Yeah.
that you get
Mhm.
later on, where it just becomes kind of this personified actor in human events. That is not how it works in Paul. It is not how it works in
Right.
Mark.
I love
And if
David
you understand,
Litwa's, David
hmm,
works on that a lot, a
yeah,
similar way that you do, where if you're going to read 1 Corinthians 15, just
yep,
calm down. So we have a whole lot of terms here. Let's just go through and figure out what they are.
and break it down.
What is a
Yep,
soma? What is a pneuma? What is a
yeah,
spirit body? What would that mean? And
exactly.
then you've got to know
And
the cosmology. So
the other one too that I think really resonates with people is this is something Stanley Stowers published, who was my dissertation advisor. And I went to Brown to study Paul under Stan. But he would talk about the difference between an objective and a subjective genitive in Greek. So whenever Paul's writing, he'll talk about Moses's faithfulness, Abraham's faithfulness. But for some reason, the New Testament, when it hits Jesus's faithfulness, will translate it as faith in Jesus. So
yeah,
Paul can be talking about how the faithfulness of these actors in human history, their faith in God's plan is the predicate for a covenant,
right.
right? Works for Moses, where Abraham works for Moses. But for some reason, when you get to Jesus, your translation is going to change it to faith in Jesus. That's a theological
It's
decision.
a
That is not a
theological
decision.
decision. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not in the Greek.
So even though we're talking about these esoteric things and vocabulary and how it's translated, I think everybody at this conference particularly is going, like, if you're going to talk about Middle Platonism, you're going to lay it out for people. So I feel people are, I mean, I want to hear what you say, and
And I
I
want to hear
think,
what you have to say.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I think people are going to go away with the sense of, wow, that was so interesting. I never really thought of that. I never really knew that. And so I really want people to sign up for this conference.
And
And
I think,
I think they'll
I
love it.
like that he calls it new insights, and that's what it
Yeah,
really is
yeah,
that we're not going to be rehearsing anything that is well-trodden territory or well-trodden, like these are new ways that the field is dealing with these issues. And I think people have to remember that we are, in the grand scheme of things, a very young field in many ways,
yeah,
because
really.
you know it, obviously the critical study of the New Testament's been around for a while, since the German Academy, around that era, the Romantic era. However, usually it was people who were themselves coming from a faith-based perspective. So, it's
Yes.
only been a few generations of scholars who have come into this field from what we might call the outside, but come from
Right.
classics or from material culture, archaeology,
Sure.
from other perspectives, to bring new insights into the field. And I think that's what
And
people will be
then
getting.
if you do that, you won't be as likely to have presuppositions about, well, Judaism, this monolithic relic that was superseded by this new Jesus thing. You would
Right.
actually understand that the movement is flowing along out of those very things, even if this particular group disagrees with this group about who the Messiah is or what he's supposed to do or whatever.
Exactly.
So here's the final question, because we don't want to make this too long for either of us or the audience. What's your favorite passage in Paul of whatever letter you want to quote? And by favorite, just anything you want to name, either insights or you really like it, or you said you love Paul. You've gained a lot of interesting things from studying Paul. Uh,
I think you mentioned it, is First Corinthians 15. And the reason
mm,
I say that is I have a piece that should be coming out. I mean, I've done the proofs, so it's either in the next issue or the issue after that, but for Harvard Theological Review, on something
mhm.
that you've worked on, which is, what does it mean for Paul to be talking about people with the coming kingdom, and this idea that the Messiah is waiting, kind of marshaling this heavenly army to bring in this new kingdom, and how people can understand their role and all of that.
Mhm.
And so, one thing I really like in Paul that I don't think gets quite enough attention, although again, people like you or David Litwa have worked on this a bit, but how space, what we would call space,
Mhm.
but cosmology works with this. Because one thing I was asking myself when I was working on that subject, and you see it in First Corinthians 15, like Paul talks about the moon a lot. Actually,
Yeah, he does.
he
Yeah.
talks about this, the stars and the moon, and he talks about things like the third heaven.
The kind of
What the heck?
glory that they have, which is
Yeah,
actually a
the
kind of
doxa.
scientific term, in terms of,
It is. That's
yeah,
what my article's about. So people
okay.
will say, like, oh, he just means it's shiny. And I go, wait a minute. Doxa as a philosophical term has been around forever. You're telling me this guy knows what pneuma is? He doesn't know what, how else to
Yeah,
translate doxa.
exactly. Okay, that's really
And
interesting
so,
because that
yeah,
would probably be
I love
mine
that.
too, along with maybe Romans 8 or something, where he thinks the
Yeah.
cosmology itself was subjected to what he called, it's translated futility, but sort of like just what the one of the laws of thermodynamics, you would call it. It just doesn't, it's not going to last. It's going to run
Yeah.
down,
And
going to
that's a Stoic
decay,
idea.
but
There's
it's going to
eons to
get
things, and
liberated
yep,
along. So he's got a huge plan in mind for
he
the
does.
cosmos. I mean, ask
Yeah.
people, does Paul believe the cosmos will be saved? And the answer is yes. He equates it in several places. So yeah, I think he's scientific in his own way. You got to know
Hmm.
your way around those heavenly spheres. You can't just sort of head up there. It's dangerous.
Yeah, and I think for people who have an afterlife imaginary that's really focused on, I don't know, like Augustine and Dante, it's weird to go back and think to yourself, well, what does Paul think the moon is? Because if you look
Yeah.
at other ancient philosophers, or look at, I mean, even go forward and say, look at Lucian. it's a clearinghouse for souls. That's where the soul's going to shoot off, because it's made of the same stuff, the ether that circles around the moon.
Yeah.
And so most Middle Platonists think that your so-called soul is going to shoot up into the atmosphere.
Yeah.
So
Well,
it becomes very interesting.
I hope your Harvard article isn't captured only by the journal, but maybe they'll give you permission to put it on academia or whatever, at least at some point.
Well, actually, Paula is editing a volume on Paula Fredrickson, with Stephen Young and Alexi, and I'm sorry, I can't remember his full last name. It begins with a CH and it's very long, so my apologies to Alexi. But they're editing a volume on Paul, and so they've asked me to do kind of a copyright safe but more accessible version of it. So it'll be in a few places.
Think about reading Paul's letters in the context of the literature of the time. I mean, it's exciting to think about, and who else wrote and who else used certain genres and approaches and so forth. And also Robyn's course, with Mythvison podcast, or Mythvison Courses, it's called, Derek Lambert's station. Many of you follow that. So, Robyn, thank you so much for, we started out during a storm, and you were freezing and pixelated, and now you're very clear.
Always. Yes, so, good. I'm glad that this worked out.
Yeah,
and thank you for a great conversation.
Gave it another try. So that's great. Thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing you virtually or face-to-face in the coming months as we move along through the year. Thanks a lot.
Same. Thank you.
Okay.